Hi, everybody. We're going to get started now. I have my colleague here, Matt Murphy, who's going to be doing the webinar with you guys. So I'll let him take it from here and give you an introduction and get started.
All right, thank you, Beth. So, welcome everyone to Piloting Digital Resources in the K6 Classroom. I'm Matt Murphy, and before we dive into the content, I think we should take a moment just to recognize why it is that this is an important topic for us to be talking about today. There was a study done recently that looked at the way that technology producers, vendors, software production companies, as well as educational professionals looked at the process through which districts vet new technology. And with technology becoming more and more pervasive in the classroom and the ed tech marketplace becoming increasingly crowded, it's important that we understand how other districts are vetting these products. And it seems that with limited trusted evidence of product success, districts rely on pilots and peer recommendations. Now, what they found in this study is that these pilots often are informal and lack data driven approaches to vetting these digital resources. One recommendation is for districts to conduct these well structured pilots that are more rigorous and more data driven. So that's what we want to look at today. There's a couple of things that we want to come out of this webinar. So of course we want to identify best practices for running effective pilots in the classroom with new technology. So we'll look at some of those tips and tricks that can help make your pilot more pointed, more efficient, and more data driven and effective. We're also going to recognize how your vendor, the vendor of those products, can actually be an invaluable resource and can actually make this a fun experiment rather than a laborious task. With more rigor and more data driven approaches comes a lot more homework for the people involved. But the vendor should be taking up some of that grunt work as well and really supporting you throughout this process. So we'll look at ways that you can leverage them and ways that you can expect them to be involved as the pilot progresses. We also want to identify common pitfalls. What are some common mistakes that people make, and how can we prepare for them, and how can we avoid them altogether? And finally, how pilots for primary and elementary grades are unique. Now, most of what we're going to be talking about today can apply across just about any grade, but there are a few little points, a few minor considerations that we need to keep in mind when we're dealing with younger children. So we've broken this whole process up into four phases. And I should tell you right off the bat that this process is front heavy. So we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about the research phase and the getting started phase. If we're doing a good job in those two phases, then the pilot and post pilot follow up phases ought to run fairly efficiently. So, I want to introduce you to somebody. I want you to meet Janice. Now, Janice is a tech coordinator for her district. She makes recommendations on new tech and new digital resources that she wants to buy for her classrooms and for her schools. She makes these recommendations to her superintendent, who ultimately makes the final purchasing decision. She's always eager to try new tech, but knows that she needs to vet them first. If she's going to ask the superintendent to drop some money on a new tool, she needs to make sure that she's not just sticking her neck out for something that's untested and unreliable. She wants to make sure it's going to be a slam dunk when it gets into the classroom. So we're going to follow Janice's journey through her own pilot and understand what are some of the things that she's doing well, what are some of the things that she's doing wrong, or could do better to make her pilot more efficient. So, to get started, Janice needs to start doing some homework. She needs to do her research and ensure that the purpose of her pilot is clear and focused. And the very first thing we need to do is make sure that we define our problem. Introducing tech into the classroom because it's a shiny new toy for teachers to play with is not a great reason to introduce the technology. Technology in the classroom should serve a specific function. Can it help you solve problems your teachers are experiencing or present opportunities for your teachers to grow? Janice's problem is regarding student performance gaps. So she's identified that there is a large gap between the high performing students and the low performing students. And of course, if she's going to get a tool or a digital resource into the classroom to help teachers close that gap, Of course, ease of use is a minimum requirement. So it needs to be easy to use, and it needs to help students, help classrooms close that performance gap. Once you have your problem defined, selecting tools to pilot is the next big challenge. So, as I mentioned, the EdTech marketplace is very crowded. There are millions of resources out there. Just do a quick Google search and you'll see exactly what I mean. It's difficult to find which tech is going to solve your problem. Now, this is a much larger topic than we have time to talk about today, but there are some resources that you can check out that'll help you find the right tools to test. Common Sense Media, for example, has a great repository of teacher reviews, parent reviews, of all sorts of different digital resources. EdSurge is another great resource. They have reviews on a wide range of EdTech products as well. And of course, they're always publishing new studies, new blog articles about new things that are happening in the marketplace. So subscribing to these two sources is a great way to get started. And of course, aside from these external resources, your teachers are also a great source of ideas. These are the ones that are experiencing the problems firsthand and probably already have some ideas as how they want to solve it. So ask them, what is it that they are dealing with in the classroom? What tools are they using to solve it now? And do they think that those tools are sufficient enough to help other people solve that problem? For K to 6, it's particularly important to ensure that the game design is age appropriate. So we call this UI UX, user interface and user experience. So this talks about how complicated the game is to play. And although digital resources may be made for younger audiences, it doesn't mean that they've been well designed for those audiences. So I want to show you a couple of examples of tools that Janice had been looking into. Jana was checking out some of these tools and noticed that the UI was in fact way too confusing. The user interface, the way that the screen looks, all of the controls of the game were way too confusing for the grades that she wanted to target. Then she hopped on to Common Sense Media, and of course, the reviews there echoed her concerns. Parents and teachers reported spending too much time helping their kids get to different parts of the game, and they seemed to be more interested in earning credits to buy clothes for their avatar than the educational gameplay itself. So that caused a lot of red flags for Janice. So she decided that, these tools may not be the way to go. Janice had been hearing about this great resource from one of her colleagues in another district, and it sounds like it checks all of the boxes she needs. It sounds like it's easy to use, it closes performance gap, um, but she also understands that her colleague's district is not her own district, and context really matters. So, what works in one area for one population or one demographic or one district may not necessarily work for Janice's district as well. So, it's important that when you're listening to peer reviews and that you're listening to recommendations, you take it with a small grain of salt and try and understand what is the context in which it's being applied in that district, and how does that compare to the context in which we'll be piloting in our own districts. So Janice has her problem identified and she has her tools selected. Now what she needs to do is understand, what does success look like in this pilot? What are the desired effects that we wanted to have, and how will we know when we've reached that success? So in a perfect world, what does success look like? One way to look at this is that it's almost like the hypothesis to this experiment. So we define our problem and we predict what we think will happen, or we predict or outline what we want to have happen. So Janice, for example, she wants to close performance gaps. She's going to do this through the use of formative performance data that her teachers can easily access and students enjoy using the tool. So see, these are some of the minimum requirements that define her success. Students need to be using the tool. It needs to have limited disruption for teachers, and students, of course, need to enjoy playing the game. So for Janice, success looks like minimizing the difference between high performing and low performing students. So this is one of the things that I think Janice could do a little bit better. You may notice that her hypothesis is highly qualitative. There's no measurable or quantifiable metric in there that's going to allow her to measure the degree of success. So One thing for you to remember is when you're thinking about the success of your own pilot is to try and incorporate both qualitative and quantitative components. So Janice may do well from adding something to her hypothesis along the lines of decrease the performance gap in science grades by 25% or reduce the standard deviation of student performance by 5%. Something like that, something that's quantifiable and can actually be a benchmark for success. And of course, if your goals and your success metrics do not align with your district's goals and priorities, this may be the point where you kind of take a step back and rethink the whole thing. It needs to be aligned with your district priorities and what your teachers are actually experiencing in the classroom. So make sure that your problem and your hypothesis are grounded in reality. So now that we know what success looks like, we need to understand how we're going to measure that success. What metrics do we need to be tracking throughout this pilot? Figuring out which metrics we need, well, we need to look in a couple of different places. Our problem and our hypothesis ought to give us a clue as to some of the data that we need to collect. In Janice's example, she's collecting performance data, or she wants to close performance gaps, so she needs to collect performance data. She also needs to make sure that teachers don't find it disruptive. She needs to make sure that she's getting good teacher adoption rates. So that's another point of data that she's going to need to collect. She also wants to be sure that she can attribute the effects of student performance to the tool that she's testing. So as a result, she needs to make sure that students are actually using it. So the usage rates is something that she's going to need to be tracking as well. Of course, her superintendent is going to be interested in what all of this costs. What is the total cost of ownership? So she needs to understand some of the costs that are associated with ongoing professional development and different training assets that may be required. If this thing is purchased on a large scale, what does that cost look like? And not just the cost of the product, but all of the ancillary supports and resources that go along with it. Getting back to the idea of why she's collecting usage rates, she wants to make sure that she can attribute the success of students to this particular product as an interventional tool, for example. So, in order for her to do that, she needs to make sure that the progress she's seeing is not just the natural trajectory of student learning. Instead, she needs to compare that data against a baseline. So she needs to collect baseline data. Now, this can come in a couple of different forms. This could be historical demographic data from standardized tests, for example, or what I would recommend is a control group. Now, this sounds like a lot of work. There's a lot of data to track, but the vendor is tracking a lot of this data anyways. So they can be a valuable resource to tap into. The vendors of the tool you are piloting have a big collaborative part to play. They have interest in your success, so it's to both parties' benefit to start fostering a relationship early on in the process. They have to have a lot of resources that you would otherwise have to create or find on your own. For example, that baseline data. Chances are they have that data somewhere from other pilots, or maybe they collected the data themselves. If it's a digital resource, they're very interested in who's using it and how they're using it. So their usage stats or your usage stats could be easily retrieved from your vendor. If they're not offering that up proactively, you should definitely be asking for it. Pre and post surveys for both your teachers and students. They'll have resources available for you for that as well. Perhaps some suggested questions or even the surveys themselves. They may have them already pre-populated and ready to go. They may offer professional development sessions to get your teachers oriented on the product or offer various implementation strategies. So that's something to consider as well. And they may have assessment resources that are age appropriate and content specific so that it applies to the content covered in the digital resource or the curricular outcomes that the digital resource aligns to. So the next step of this process is defining your timeline. In negotiations with your vendor, you may have defined a start and end date to the pilot, but these should not be the only times on your calendar. You need time to recruit your participants and get them trained on the product, get them oriented in the pilot process, understanding what their roles are. You also need to schedule routine check-ins and benchmarks, collaborative meetings for the participants of the pilot program. This will help you identify any barriers and gather feedback and collect that data that you need. And you can address any problems or remove barriers immediately rather than discovering at the end of the pilot that there was a flaw in the experimental process, if you will, that affects the results of the pilot. And as a result, the whole thing might end up being a wash. But if you're scheduling those check-ins and if you know when those check-ins are supposed to happen beforehand, you're more likely to identify those problems proactively and remove them before they end up putting the brakes on the whole process. Janice did this, and she specified exactly what needs to happen where and when. You can see that she's identified her recruitment phase, her orientation phase. She's got a couple of different classroom visits scheduled there where she's going to talk to students. She's going to conduct the different assessments necessary so that she can collect progress data. So she's got all of her all of her data collection processes built into this timeline. Now, Janice's timeline may need to be revised as problems arise, and that's okay. This shouldn't be set in stone, but at the same time, you shouldn't allow the flexibility to get out of hand. If you start pushing a data collection point out a week, and then another week, and then 3 more days, and then 5 more days, and then till after the Christmas break, you're going to compromise the validity of the experiment itself by compromising the timeline. So yes, there should be some wiggle room to allow for unexpected problems or issues that pop up, but you should try and stick to your defined timeline as best as you can. Now, one of the most common questions raised is whether or not you should be expected to pay for the pilot. Now, literature on this topic is typically written from the vendor's perspective, and they say that you know they should pay because your time and product are valuable. The same logic, however, can be applied to the buyer side of the transaction as well. If you're financially invested in a pilot program, you're more emotionally invested and are therefore more interested in seeing the process through, even if it ends up in a decision not to purchase the tool. The tool is a failure, it doesn't solve the problem exactly the way we need it to be solved. Getting a null result in an experiment is just as valuable as a positive result. When you're negotiating with your vendor, find out all the things that they're going to provide you and what services they are going to offer. In Janice's case, for example, she's getting a lot of data collection support. They're going to train the teachers and provide resources such as lesson plans or implementation strategies. And of course, they will have a direct line to the IT and game design teams within the production company. So this will allow them to respond efficiently and effectively to any issues, any bugs, any feature requests that they may have as the pilot progresses. Janice is also wondering about whether this price is final. Recent literature has suggested that educational administrators and educational professionals in general often neglect negotiating better prices for new tech. We educators were notorious for saying, "All right, that's the price tag. We're not going to get a better deal than that, so we'll accept it." But never ever be afraid to ask. These vendors want your money, and they're not going to shut the door on you on them potentially receiving some money just because you've asked for a lower price. So now we have our research done and we are certain that the pilot is aligned with district goals and teacher and student needs. It's time to get some planning done. So one of the first things we need to do is we need to assemble our team. We need to gather our participants as to who's going to be participating in this pilot. This is important because cost of the pilot, what you're being charged by the vendor to try the product out, is often defined by the number of participants. The more people you have, the higher the price tag. So you should know about how many participants you want to participate in this pilot. The way you select your participants may also create bias or skew your data. So for example, calling on volunteers. This is great for pilots that are targeted at student impact. We do not want adoption or utilization to be a source of uncertainty or limiting factor. And if we're telling teachers, you need to use this and you need to use this, and you're not going to get to use this, but you're going to be in our control group, there's going to be a little bit of pushback from some of those individuals, and they're not going to approach it with the same sort of enthusiasm as a volunteer would. Instead, if we get volunteers, they're going to want to use the product, they're going to want to use the digital resource in their classroom, and we're going to get a boatload of utilization rates and a boatload of data as a result of it. And this will produce a clearer and more valid picture and more valid results as to what this product can do. Another option is random selection, and this is useful for when you are looking at adoption rates or disruption in the classroom. This will give you an idea of the impact it'll have on schools and faculty when it scales beyond the pilot. And regardless of whether you're going volunteers or random selection, and of course that should be defined by what it is you're trying to learn, whether it's adoption or effectiveness, you should also have a handful of teachers that are subject matter experts or that are notoriously honest and forthcoming or have any other desirable qualities that would make them champions in this pilot. This will help curb some of the uncertainty that comes along with the fact that primary and elementary teachers are talented generalists. But if you're getting a product that is math specific or science specific, you want to have those subject matter experts in your corner to be able to really drill down into the scientific pedagogy or the numeracy that's involved and how effective it is at addressing some of those concerns. So you should target a few, perhaps two or three champions within this pilot that you can lean on or that you know are going to be really enthusiastic about this product. So once you have your team assembled, it's time to get them trained up on the whole process and on the product itself. So we want to get them in a room and we want to inform them about the timelines of the pilot. What are the goals of the pilot? What does success look like for this pilot? Get them oriented as to how to use the product or the digital resource, and all of the stuff that we were doing in the research phase. We want to make sure it's as transparent as possible so that they're ready to hit the ground running and ensure that they're set up for success within this pilot as well. So be sure to plan for and organize these professional development sessions to kick off the pilot, and perhaps have another one shortly after it, so that you can make sure that everything's running smoothly, make sure there's no obstacles or barriers that you'd easily be able to remove. So Janice has her team selected and is ready to train them. She's recognized that one of the biggest parts of participant training is to ensure that they understand the roles that they fulfill and what is expected of them as they go through this pilot. It is also important for her participants to know what others are doing so they know how their role fits into the bigger picture. So we need to almost create like a terms of reference or a job description for each of these different roles. And we should try and be as specific as possible. So let's see how Janice filled out these roles. Let's see what functions she's assigned to the different roles in her pilot. So Janice's role it is largely that of facilitation. She's going to be involved in some of the data collection process, and after everything is said and done, she'll be the one creating the report, and she will also liaise with the vendor. So she'll be the vendor's point of contact. And if any problems come up with a teacher, she'll be the one to talk to the vendor about those problems. The teacher's role, well, she's defined that there needs to be a minimum requirements for the tool's usage over a given period of time. Whatever those minimum requirements are, those should be clearly defined. And submitting the data that comes out of the classroom and conducting the surveys that ask about teachers' opinions. Do they find the product useful? Is it usable? And things like that. The vendor also, as we've been talking about this a lot, the vendor has a big role to play. They're going to be providing resources like lesson plans and professional development sessions. They're also going to be involved in the data collection process, and they're expected to respond to the feedback that Janice is sending to them. So they'll be liaising with the district. Students, their role is pretty straightforward. They just need to use the tool and give their feedback. And kids are quick to do that. They're going to provide their feedback whether you want it or not. And the parents, because we have such a young audience, we want to make sure that we're getting the parents involved as well. We need to make sure that their privacy concerns are being respected, and so sending home a permission slip that yes, my child is has permission to participate in this experiment, and assuring them that no personal information is going to be shared or published, and no identifiable information, no information that will identify them is going to be made public or available to any sort of vendor or anything like that. So making sure that they're involved. This is one of those unique considerations for younger grades. Now, it may be also true for 7 to 12, but I think we need to be particularly cautious about it for these younger grades in what they often call the vulnerable sector. So we need to make sure that we're cautious of that. Janice has a lot of data to collect and needs to create a lot of data collection tools. She needs assessments for her student performance data. She needs teacher questionnaires so that she can understand what teachers thought about it. Now, you can create these fairly easily using Google Forms or SurveyMonkey. You can create digital surveys very easily. Both of those tools have freemium versions of the product, so you don't need to pay a cent to run those surveys. But there will be some limitations as to what you can do. But the point being that she needs to create these questionnaires and get them into teachers' hands. A classroom observation protocol is also a useful tool for her to have, particularly if she's visiting classrooms. Classroom visits should be structured so as to ensure that she's collecting the same data from every class. And she also wants to make sure that she's limiting bias and not making sure she's and making sure she's not skewing data. The classroom observation protocol is going to help her do this. If she walks into the classroom and she's shouting about how awesome this new tool is, that could taint the results or color the opinions of the teachers and students one way or the other. So she needs to be very objective when she walks in there, and the classroom observation protocol ought to define what that objectiveness looks like. We also can't be in 4 schools at once. If we have 20 schools that are involved in this pilot and we want to visit each of them twice during a 6-week or 2-month time frame, that's near on impossible. So if she has a team of classroom visitors, she'll want to make sure that they're all following the same rules, all collecting the same data, all following the same procedure. And so this classroom observation protocol is going to help her do that. She also needs to understand her usage. Now, this is almost impossible for her to track independently without access to the back end code of the product, which she probably can't get access to herself. So asking your vendor for this information is going to be very valuable. If they're not giving it to you proactively, make sure you're asking for it. So aside from the usage data, your vendor should have a lot of these resources readily available for you. If they don't have the resources themselves, they may have advice to offer as to how to effectively create these tools, or a list of questions or recommended questions that you may want to include in your teacher questionnaire, for example. So lean on your vendor. Ask them about how they're collecting data, what data they're collecting, and what sort of resources they may have to help you collect the data you need to collect as well. We also find ourselves at another one of those primary elementary quirks for piloting process for the pilot process, and that's we need to make sure that our data collection tools are accessible to the age group. If you put a 20-question survey in front of a grade 1 student, they're likely not going to give you great data. Instead, have informal interviews. Those classroom visits are going to be where you're collecting that student data, the performance data, making sure those assessments are age appropriate and they reflect activities that they've seen in the game or in the digital resource, or activities that they've done in class. Also, make sure that if you're interviewing a child, for example, you don't write their name at the top of the interview notes. You don't want to identify them in any of your data collection processes. It's important at this point, and not just the report when you're creating the report, we need to make sure that if we accidentally leave our notes somewhere or on the bus or something, that we're not compromising the student's privacy. So make sure that everyone remains anonymous during this process as well. So it's now time to get boots on the ground. It's time to kick this pilot into high gear. If we've done our due diligence prior to kickoff, then the pilot itself should be relatively straightforward. However, we still don't have the luxury of setting it and forgetting it. There's a few things that we need to do to ensure that the whole thing runs smoothly. If you'll recall when we were talking about the roles and responsibilities that Janice was defining, Janice's role became that of a facilitator. She's going to be visiting the classrooms to observe the tool in action, and that's a great way to gauge the success or lack thereof of the tool. It'll also help her identify and remove barriers. So this is going to be a very large part of her role as the pilot is running. As she collects data from various sources, she also needs to strive to provide any support that her participants may need. Also, during her classroom visits, Janice has been hearing complaints about load times and broken buttons in the software. Does this mean that the tool is a failure? Not necessarily. As you may recall, another one of Janice's roles was to act as the liaison with the vendor. So she can easily report these errors, report these bugs and feature requests to the vendor, and they want to know about these errors and bugs and feedback just as much as you want to be heard. So don't write the tool off just because of a few small problems. They may be able to fix it very easily for you, and the more you communicate with them, the more likely you are to get a product that's custom made to your needs, particularly if it's a new product to the market. They're still developing it and trying to understand what is it that teachers and students want. So tell them what you want, and they'll you have a high chance of it getting incorporated into their product design. As was mentioned already, Janice's role is that of facilitation. And collaboration is one of those things that Janice should be facilitating. If you recall on her timeline, she has planned for group check in meetings to help identify best practices, ideas for implementation, troubleshooting, and anything else that participants want to discuss. Although Janice should not be dominating this time, she should act as the meeting chair and facilitate these group led discussions. She can create an affinity space, or better known as a community of practice, around the tool that they're using. Again, your vendor may have supports of this nature, but it becomes much more personal and effective when the space is homegrown. So, a simple Facebook group, or we've actually seen examples where a simple Twitter hashtag can act as an affinity space. So, that's where teachers can actually collaborate through Twitter, through their own Twitter accounts to talk about these items. A simple Facebook group, discussion forum, or even a Slack channel are often sufficient. It doesn't need to be super fancy. It will also not take long for your power users or your early adopters, those champions, to start to emerge. So celebrate them, and with their permission, of course, open up the lines of communication between them and their fellow participants. Get them connected with the other participants so that they can share their successes and really be an advocate for the whole process. The pilot has ended, and the participants have all provided their data and feedback. Janice is sitting on a pile of data. Now what? So Janice needs to start making sense out of all this data. And this slide and the idea of data analysis is enough to make anyone's head spin. So if you're thinking, wow, this is way outside of my wheelhouse, don't worry, you're not alone. It's not an easy thing to do. But guess who can help you out with it? Your vendor. They've been helping you out throughout this whole process. There's no reason they can't help you with the data analysis. As a matter of fact, it's often negotiated into the pilot contract or the agreement that defines the roles of the different parties involved in the pilot. So Ask them when you're in negotiations, what sort of data analysis are they able to do? Are they willing to do? What can you get them to do? And so this might be your student performance data, your baseline and control group comparison. Make sure that if they are going to do your data analysis, that they are including that baseline and control group comparison. Otherwise, without the context, the data is kind of meaningless in terms of the goal or the problem that you initially defined. One thing to also keep in mind as you're doing this data analysis or this consolidation is to consolidate that qualitative and quantitative data. Students, for example, may be reporting loving using the tool in their class, but if performance data does not show growth, that tool is not having the desired effect. So looking at the qualitative data in isolation may give you a false positive. You need to compare the two and see what's happening. Usage rates, for example, may not be hitting their critical threshold to be effective. Teacher interviews may reflect frustration and confusion on how to implement it, but usage data may show that they never really took the time to give it the old college try. This may suggest that more professional development is needed, which is valuable information for understanding the total cost of ownership or what may be necessary if you are going to do a second larger scale pilot or full implementation. When it's all over, the task becomes getting your findings into the right people's hands. If you're not the decision maker, be sure to understand what information they require and in what form they require it, and what criteria they need to move forward with the decision. Other districts and educational professionals can also benefit from your diligently conducted experiment. However, if this report is going public or being used by people outside of your realm of influence, be sure to remove anything that might compromise student privacy. This is particularly important for primary and elementary students, and we keep talking about this, but I can't stress it enough. I'm going to say however again. However, as anonymous as your participants should be, we mentioned earlier the importance of context. You ought to still provide some context about your district, your schools, and even your classrooms so that people in other districts will have a better idea of how your experiences may translate to their context. Different demographics may respond to the tool differently. Finally, your relationship with the vendor should not end at the end of the pilot. Do not simply allow yourself to become another nameless account number. Stay in touch and be a source of continuous feedback. This is a surefire way to make sure that your voice is heard, and improve your chances of influencing the direction of the product as it develops and grows. So that brings us to the end of the whole process. We started with doing our homework and our research, and some of the key things to remember there, some of the key takeaways, is to make sure that you know the problem, that the problem is clearly defined, and with that is going to come your metrics. If you understand from the very beginning what it is you need to measure, and if in fact you can measure those metrics, that's going to help ensure the success of this process. Once you've done your research, you're ready to get started, don't just dive in head first. We need to do some preparations. So prepare your data collection tools and make sure that they're aligned with those metrics you need to collect. Make sure that they're age appropriate and audience appropriate, whatever that audience might be, your teachers, students, parents. There needs to be alignment there. Recruiting and training your participants. The way you recruit them is going to be dependent on what it is you're hoping to get out of this pilot or out of your participants. And throughout this entire process, make sure you understand what your vendor is going to do for you as well. If the answer is nothing, look for a different product because your vendor should be supporting you through this. They're just as invested in your success as you are. So if they're not doing anything for you, check out a different vendor because that should be a huge red flag. Once you're ready to start going, your role switches to that of facilitator. You need to facilitate collaboration between your participants and make sure that you have boots on the ground identifying problems, successes, and anything else that may come up during the process. And anything that can be fixed by your vendor, make sure that you are in regular contact with them. You need to act as the liaison with that vendor to maximize the chances of success of this product and the pilot itself. Once it's all over, you always need to make sure that participant privacy is paramount, particularly for young audiences. And you're probably already sick of hearing me talk about it, but it's super important, particularly for these younger students. We need to make sure that their privacy is protected, and any sensitive information is never made available to anyone. And of course, once the report is in the appropriate people's hands, we shouldn't just let the vendor relationship dwindle and fade into obscurity. Maintain that relationship. You just spent 2 months working with them, so you want to maintain that professional relationship and get as much out of that relationship as you possibly can, because there is a lot that your vendors are willing to do for you. If they're not willing to do anything, red flag. You should be looking elsewhere and reconsidering them as an educational partner. So that brings us to the end of today's session. So I want to thank everyone for attending. I hope that you guys have taken are able to take away a few tips and tricks as to how we can refine our piloting process, how we can make it more rigorous and more data driven without making it more laborious. It should be a fun experiment. You're experimenting with something new, and that should always be exciting and never exhausting.
All right, thanks so much, Matt. That was awesome. We are now going to take about 10 to 15 minutes and answer some questions that we have here in the chat and the Q&A section. Um, all right, we have a question here. Somebody's wondering when they should ask for usage data from the vendor and at what frequency should you be asking for this?
So that's a great question, Beth. So your usage data is one of your key metrics that you're monitoring, and it's not going to so much tell you the success of the impact of the tool on student performance, but it's really going to help you validate or measure the validity of this pilot process. So in our experience, we send out the usage data once a week or once every 2 weeks. And if we notice something is out of the ordinary, if they have, say, 10 teachers or 10 schools involved, and only 3 or 4 of them have actually activated and got logged some time on our digital resources, we'll reach out proactively and say, hey, we're 2 or 3 weeks into the process. This pilot program is at risk of falling off the rails if we don't do something to get these people activated. So it's definitely not an after the fact sort of thing. It's something you should be monitoring as regularly as possible. We're collecting that data just about every day, and we're looking at it, very regularly. So it's something that you should be interested in as well, to monitor on a regular basis. It'll help you identify any problem areas that your teachers are experiencing, any sort of roadblocks, and allows you to remove them early on in the process so that you don't get to the end of the program or end of the pilot and realize, hey, only half of my participants actually logged real data. So that's the idea. That's why we want to monitor that usage data, and so looking at it as regularly as possible is the recommended frequency for that sort of analysis.
All right, we have another question here. Somebody's wondering, how do we select data collection tools? You talked a bit about the actual data collection, but how do we know what tools are going to be the most useful for what we're looking for?
Yeah, that's another great question. When you're looking at your data collection tools and trying to figure out, well, what are all the data collection tools that I need to collect all of this data, you need to consider the alignment between the problem, the data that's going to inform that problem, and the data collection tools that are going to help you mine that data. So, for example, one of the things that Janice was looking at was the student opinions of the resource. What did the students think of it? Did they find it to be a fun and usable resource? And so the problem was student engagement. The data was student opinions, and those opinions are locked inside those kids' heads. And the only way to unlock that data is to sit down with them and interview them and understand how they're using the tools, what they like about it, what they don't like about it. So that interview would be the data collection tool, and it aligns with the type of data we're looking to collect, and which aligns to the problem. So it's kind of hierarchical. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, but there's a hierarchy in there, and a relationship between the problem, the data, and the data collection tool. So whatever metrics you're trying to collect, you need to make sure that the data collection tool you've selected is aligned directly to that. And that needs to be evaluated and decided upon on a case by case basis. There's no one data collection tool that's going to collect all the data for you, but for every piece of data, there is a way to find that out, to collect that data.
Okay, and now we have another question. You mentioned recommending control groups over standardized testing data as a baseline. Why is a control group preferable? Can you elaborate on this a little bit, Matt?
Yeah, of course, I'd be happy to elaborate on that. If you're conducting a longitudinal study, which most pilot programs are, you're trying to understand how a student progresses from the start of the pilot to the end of the pilot. It's more valid and more reliable to have your baseline also exist as a longitudinal consideration. Looking at standardized test data from previous years is cross-sectional. So you're looking probably at a different demographic altogether, or a different group of students. So there may be some disconnects there in terms of who it is that's providing that data, but also you're getting a snapshot versus the progression. So how did the control group start and how did they end? And that'll give you the natural trajectory of student learning without the digital resource. If you're able to compare that over the same time frame to a group of students that has been exposed to that digital resource, you're getting a more one-to-one comparison, and that's going to allow you to create a uh, better. It's going to help you draw better conclusions because that comparison is so it's much more closely linked to one another.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. That was great. There was a few questions that we didn't have a chance to cover. If you did ask something and we didn't answer it on the Q&A, we will follow up with an email when we send you the replay with some more in-depth information on your questions to make sure that we do get those answered for you. So you should expect a replay in your email within the next 24 hours. And if you do have any questions, feel free to send us an email at info@zorbitsmath.com or tweet us at zorbitsmath, and we'd be happy to get back to you. All right. Thank you, everybody, and stay tuned for future webinars. You can check it out on our website at zorbitsmath.com. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.